This week I wanted to get back to, so you want to talk about race. And as I read through the middle chapters of the book, and as I walked through this past week along with everyone else, it suddenly became very clear to me kind of how to sum up what that book is telling us and what we've been experiencing. And that is that while we call this the United States of America, it's really different countries. And, you know, I titled this A Tale of Two Countries, but what it really is a country for able-bodied, straight, cisgendered white men and their families. And then a bunch of other different countries, depending on who one may be. As I was searching for images, I stopped at this one because it reminded me of one of my earliest personal recollections of actual racism. This is not in my hometown, but when I was a little boy, I remember really very specifically, I don't know where we were, but we had gone somewhere and we were outside, and I can't remember if it was at a park or at someone else's swimming pool, what the venue was. But I went to get a drink of water, and there were two drinking fountains. This is probably 1965, 1966, somewhere in there. And there was a pretty nice looking water fountain for, being a public water fountain outside. And it was labeled whites. And then there was this really gnarly, old, nasty, rusty pipe, basically, fountain that had a spigot on one end of it. And like this sign, it was labeled coloreds. And what I remember about that experience was being absolutely befuddled at why are there two drinking fountains? Why is there a nice fountain and a bad fountain? I was just flabbergasted. I did not understand why anybody would make somebody drink out of a not nice fountain when there's a nice fountain there. And I still don't. But that's children. I think it's pretty obvious that racism is inherited, not, or it's taught, not, passed down genetically. We get it by association from our parents, grandparents, et cetera, et cetera. We're not born with it. And so throughout the middle chapters of So You Want to Talk About Race, the author makes it very clear under a bunch of different headings how her experience and the experience of people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color, and, quite frankly, some of the members of the LGBTQ community in various different ways, their experiences of this country are not the experience I had. And quite frankly, even my wife's experience is very different than my experience. And there are just a plethora of ways that we can talk about this. But the main thing to do is to really, especially for people that look like me, right? Straight, cisgendered, able-bodied white guys. We have to really be able to take our blinders off. Like, I was wearing blinders as a kid. I had no idea, right? And understand that because we are experiencing a thing in a way that not everyone else experiences the same thing in the same way. It's one thing to think, well, I grew up differently than them because I lived in a little town by the Ohio River in West Virginia. and they lived in Detroit, or they lived in Birmingham, or they lived, no, we could live in the same place and have a very different experience with the same people. She says, I know that it's hard to believe that the people you look to for safety and security are the same people who are causing us so much harm, but I'm not lying and I'm not delusional. I am scared and I am hurting and we are dying, and I really, really need you to believe me. And she's talking about the experience that the Black community has with the law enforcement community. And as I was looking for images to illustrate this, I ran across this one, and I know we're in Alabama, but I included it because I grew up in West Virginia. And I never even considered race growing up where I grew up in West Virginia. And, come to find out decades later, the part of that is because I grew up in an almost all white, little bubble. To call Vienna a suburb is kind of laughable, but technically it's kind of what it was. It was about a 13,000 person suburb of a larger town of about 50,000, and Vienna's where white people lived. There weren't a whole lot of Black people in Parkersburg, but the Black people we had in Wood County were all in Parkersburg because they weren't allowed in Vienna, and I didn't know that growing up. But you know what? My own dad was one of the people keeping them out. He owned Vienna Real Estate, the company. I had no idea. But when I see the statistic, we have West Virginia has one of the highest racial disparities in the nation, with Black people 7.3 times more likely to be arrested than white people. And it's just like, where does this come from? And again, that's white privilege. That's the privilege I grew up with. I had no idea. So when Ijeoma says, I really, really need you to believe me, it may take a little effort, but I'm going to have to believe her. I got to give her the benefit of the doubt. And, having lived in the city of Birmingham now for a while, I'm starting to see it. I'm starting to get it. I'll never understand it the way that people who grew up Black understand it, right? But I can at least do my best. And when she talks about why things are the way they are, and this is where we dig down into, well, what are some of the causes of this? Not just the fact that, okay, the police are in some ways biased towards going after members of the Black, indigenous people of color community. But when you get down to actual real systemic issues, this one statistic is one that absolutely blows me away every time I look at it. When the average Black American has 1/13 the net worth of the average white American, when the poverty rate among Native Americans is over 3 times that of whites. Well, is it any wonder that community, the neighborhoods where Blacks and indigenous and other people of color are more crime ridden? The people don't have money, so they're going to try to survive any way they can, right? She says it's a strong bet that neighborhoods of color are more likely to be poor neighborhoods with higher crime, and that higher priced neighborhoods with easier access to jobs and more funding for education that lead to less crime would be more likely to be populated by comparatively wealthier white people. It's not like we all started even, and white people work 13 times harder than Black people. That's not the case. That's not how this came to be. And, we could go into the historical reasons for wealth disparity, but that's a different talk for a different day. And as she continued on and was talking about affirmative action and the things that people of color, women, disabled people all have to deal with. This quote jumped out at me because it sounded a lot like something that I've heard Laura say about her experience being a female in the workforce.
You're frozen on my computer. I don't know if you're frozen on everyone else. You might want to ask.
I'm frozen?
On mine. I don't know if you are on everyone else.
Hey guys, am I frozen on everybody else's computer? Anybody else's?
You're not frozen on mine, but if you're showing images or a PowerPoint, I can't see that.
You're not seeing it? Oh, okay. My bad.
You're good.
How did I miss that? Huh. Yeah, I've been, all right. I guess when I lost the PowerPoint before and then I brought it back, I just, gotta love this. Okay, here we go.
Yeah. Oh, there we go. I can see it now. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So anyway, Laura has pointed out, several times and said something almost exactly like this. If you're a person of color, disabled person, a single mother, an LGBTQ person, you have to be exceptional. It's not enough just to be, as good as Joe White guy next to you. You got to be better than Joe White guy. And as Ijeoma says, and if you are exceptional by the standards put forth by white supremacist patriarchy, and you are lucky, you will most likely just barely get by. There's nothing inspirational about that. And again, I can't argue with this, because I am that white guy. It does make me think back to times in my life when, I sometimes wonder now, did I really deserve that thing that I got, or was it just because I was the tall, loud white guy? I was one of those, and I was kind of a brainy kid growing up, and so I was always one of the ones who would sit in the front row in class, except for when I was in high school and doing things I shouldn't have been doing in high school. But I would sit in the front row in class, and I was always very I always would get, like, say, an A in class participation because I wouldn't shut up, basically. So I just wonder how many times that white supremacist patriarchy worked in my favor. And then I hear Laura describe some of the things that she's gone through and some of the hurdles she's had to overcome. And it really is, even just men and women occupy a different country here within the borders of the United States. So in talking about affirmative action, Ijeoma said that affirmative action is a crucial tool if we want to mitigate some of the effects of systemic racism and misogyny in our society. Again, we can go back to the root causes of economic inequality and of opportunistic inequality, and I can spend days talking about that probably. And some people will complain about affirmative action and say it's reverse discrimination, it's not fair. But it seems to me that we have to do some things, plural, to undo some of the injustice that has basically become the norm. Some people listening to this might wonder, why in the heck is this guy talking about this, in a church on Sunday? Shouldn't you be uplifting people and talking about Jesus or something? The thing is, Jesus dealt with this exact same thing. I think everybody here has been through an Easter with me at least once, and you've heard me talk about John Dominic Crossan and Marcus Borg's book, The Last Week, and how they described that what Jesus was up against was a domination system in which a small percentage of the people held both a large percentage of the wealth and the power, and the religion of the day legitimated what they were doing. Basically said, "Yep, God set it up this way, so that's the way you guys just need to get used to it." And in fact, what was happening, specifically in the time of Jesus, so up until Herod's death, which was, apparently right after Jesus was born, he had ruled. He and Roman governors had ruled over Judea, but basically they had some kerfuffles right after Herod died. There was some scuffling for who was going to be in charge, and after the Romans put down the uprising, they left the Jewish temple authorities in charge. So it was really their own people doing it to them. And I got to tell you, here in the United States of America, our own people are doing this to us. And as in Jesus's time, so the temple authorities, they kind of start tweaking the rules a little bit. And instead of the Levites back in the Hebrew scriptures were supposed to be given a tenth of what everybody else produced, but the Levites weren't supposed to own land, right? Well, they decided to tweak the rules a little bit, when Jesus was coming on. And so now the priestly class was able to own land as long as they didn't work it. And slowly what happened was the power and the money kept flowing upwards and flowing upwards. And it was getting to the point where not only was there not much of a middle class, quote unquote, left in Israel, but the poor were getting poorer. And it was to the point where many of them having a difficult time simply putting enough calories into their body every day to survive. And while, yes, many of us are doing okay today, when we look around this nation that is really several different nations, ever since the 70s and the changes in the tax codes, then we've seen more and more of the wealth of the nation flow upwards, just like it did in Jesus's time. And more people are falling, without a safety net. And boy, right now, in this time that we're in, we are seeing that in spades. It's so obvious. We have, people all around this country who are being evicted, who are going into foreclosure, who have lost their homes, who've lost their jobs, who've lost their health care. And at the same time, we've got some billionaires who have been making money hand over fist since this thing started. The stock market's doing great. Well, that's fine for the roughly 10% of the people who own about 94% of the stock market. But for everybody else, it's scary. And it's not the same country. A friend of mine recently, this guy I served in the National Guard with, he pushed out a little comment on Facebook about how people who haven't spent significant time in other countries, don't know what they have, and they all need to be grateful. And so I thought about my time overseas, and in both times I deployed, it was to Kuwait, which is an extremely wealthy country per capita, and yet it also has some of the poorest people in the world in it. And what the Kuwaitis do is they actually import poor people. My first time overseas, they called them TCNs, which stood for Third Country Nationals. And then by the second time I went over, we were supposed to call them OCNs, for Other Country Nationals. In other words, we weren't supposed to, kind of denigrate them by by suggesting they were from third world countries, even though that's in fact where they were from. Most of them were from the Philippines or from Burma, from basically from Southeast Asia, a lot of them. And most of them were employed in many cases in the 110, 115, 120, 125 degree heat for about a KD, one Kuwaiti dollar, which was about $5.15 at the time, an hour. Interesting to note that those folks, who are essentially in kind of an indentured servitude, were being paid almost, what an American worker who makes minimum wage makes. That's not the kind of country I want to live in. I don't want to live in a country that has a bunch of excessively wealthy people at the top and then a bunch of people barely scraping by, trying to get enough calories into their body and hoping that they have a secure place to sleep at night. I don't, that's not what Jesus was talking about. And that's not what I see for us. There's got to be a better way. One of the things that we are up against is taking these children, these children of color, these black and brown kids, and literally running a pipeline for them from the schools to the prisons. And I know that seems hyperbolic when we say it, but the numbers really do bear that out. So when you look at it, and these are just some examples, black students make up only 16% of our school populations, yet 31% of students who are suspended and 40% of students who are expelled are black. Black students are 3.5 times more likely to be suspended than white students. 70% of students who are arrested in school and referred to law enforcement are black. Okay, so it's 16% of the kids, yet there's 70% of the arrests. I can tell you, I did things in high school that I should have been arrested for. Never once, right? In school, nothing. In the 2011-2012 school year alone, 92,000 students were arrested. That's kind of a mind-boggling number. So on this slide, I have some of the reasons that this happens, and the biggest difference, I can sum it up, is most of the teachers are not from the same country as the kids, right? There is an implicit racial bias in both the administrators and the teachers in our schools. And implicit means it's there in the back of your mind. You may not know it's there, but it's there. A lack of cultural sensitivity for black and brown children. One of the things that she points out is a lot of the play that some of the black kids get into may look like fighting, to their white teachers. They're not fighting. They're just playing. They're kids. The pathologizing of I misspelled that, of black children. Immediately saying, oh, well, they got a learning disability, instead of digging a little bit deeper. Laura and I were talking last night about the book. And if you remember, I shared it with you, the one where we were talking about adverse childhood experiences. Well, when a kid has, 3, 4, 5, 6 or more adverse child experiences that are messing with the wiring in their brains, okay, that kid may just quickly get labeled as having ADHD. The kid doesn't have ADHD. There's a whole different bunch of issues going on. But if we don't start asking questions and you just slap a label on that kid and then you shove them over into an alternative program, we lost that kid, and we didn't have to. Zero tolerance policies, increased police presence in schools. Hey, you want to increase the school to prison pipeline? Let's just put an officer to arrest them right there and shove them straight in. Why not? I tell you, I don't know how well you guys can see this this slide that I grabbed over here as a as an example, but some of these things just absolutely blew my mind, and especially when we got into the, you know, from foster care to prison. So half the kids in the foster care system are Black or Latino, and again, they're still numerically minorities. But a quarter of the people, of the young people leaving foster care, will be incarcerated within a few years after turning 18. Half of them will be unemployed. And then this one, of the inmates in California state prisons, 70% are former foster care children. We're just failing these kids. There's no other way to put it. And there's got to be a better way. There has got to be a better way. And I love this idea that's on this graphic here. Instead, you know, get rid of school to prison and let's come up with a system that we call cradle to college, because it's where it really starts. It's not just, you know, at age 5 or 6. We start with children when they're babies, right? We change the school to prison pipeline to the cradle to college pipeline and put an end to all the arrests and summons for non-criminal violations in schools. So things to do, you know, talk about this. Talk about it to your schools and your school boards, right? Challenge language that stereotypes Black and brown kids, terms like thugs and gangbangers. Discuss the deeper causes of defiant and antisocial behavior in Black and brown kids. Again, we go back to the ACEs and what have they done to these kids? Not just mentally, not just their, you know, their attitude or their outlook, but literally physically. What have they done to rewire these kids' brain? Don't erase disabled Black and brown youth. And you know, the bottom one I think is really huge. Challenge the legitimacy of white-centered education. Yeah.
So one of the things that I read that I thought was really interesting is that one of the reasons why, especially white teachers, stereotype Black and brown kids is because a lot of those kids are raised speaking African American vernacular English. And what those teachers think of it as is bad English or not correct English, when in reality, it's a completely valid form of English. It's its own language. And what we should be doing is saying, like, here is also another way to talk, as opposed to saying, like, you're talking like an ignorant person, you're talking like an uneducated person. So there's all this bias that comes into play because kids are raised with AAVE instead of being raised speaking with the dominant vernacular.
Wow. I wasn't
Yeah,
aware.
I read, I think, an article about that, and it was really fascinating. And it was talking about how, you know, a lot of, you know, we should really consider this as being like they're learning English as a second language, not because it's completely different, but because, you know, it does have its own rules. It has, you know, different things that you follow, just like a normal language. And if you treat it more as an ESL, then it's helpful for teachers in that way. And it was really fascinating to read. And, you know, I think a lot of us have fallen into that trap of thinking, you know, not talking right or whatever, like if I don't, but at the same time, like learning, you know, more about it and like, and I don't know, getting out there and meeting people from different backgrounds has helped immensely. You know, I've realized after moving from kind of a homogenous society in a small town to a bigger city where you meet more people really helps you to face those biases. And you can't make everybody move, obviously, but, you know, it's something that really helps me. And I don't know where I'm going with this. I'm just rambling now.
That's
Sorry.
okay.
That's okay.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit, you know, obviously it's not entirely the same, but even between like people that live in the South and people that live in the North. We have like somewhat tame things, you know, people look at you weird if you ask for sweet tea. And, you know, my mom, when she moved from the North to a Southern school, got in trouble all the time because of the yes sir, yes ma'am thing that she didn't learn. So they called her rude. They, you know, that they treated her like she was being rude when that's was never her intention. But what I also, I guess, wanted to say is like it's interesting to me that we reject, you know, people that speak in what I'm going to call a different dialect to me, because as someone who's like obsessed over Asian culture, I mean, China has a ton of dialects. And yes, the people within the country do not necessarily understand everything they say back and forth. Like there are some gaps in communication and all that. And they do it, and maybe they don't do it well, but like acknowledging that as just, this is a different way to speak English, that makes sense to me. And it doesn't, ugh. And I don't really know exactly where this fits into this, but you know, my friend Amani is from New York, and when she first moved here and I met her in middle school, she would be bullied so much, so painfully by people of her own race, because of how she sounded and because of the friends she has. And it's just, it's exhausting. And I would love for those kinds of things, you know, for differences in language and dialect and in all of that to just be accepted and not, you know, because I don't, if those kids weren't treated so poorly, the ones that bullied her for speaking the way they did, maybe they wouldn't have had such a, you know, violent reaction to her, you know. I don't know. But that's just some anecdotes from me.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's good. That is good, and absolutely the kind of stuff we're talking about. It's funny how many different countries there are within these borders. You know, countries where you know, like even people of a similar demographic. I mean, because you know, a white guy from Maine trying to talk to a white guy from Georgia, they may not understand each other, right? And you know, the same thing. A black girl from New Jersey and a black girl from Mississippi, they may have a tough time. But there's no
When she
reason.
goes right back up to New York, then she gets jokes about how her accent's changed. She gets it from both sides.
Yep. And yes, it's for us to not simply say, oh, you must be from over there, and treat people decently, as opposed to what most of us experience. It's a step we still got to take. So I'm going to be respectful of everybody's time. There's more. I've got more stuff on here, but I actually could continue this next week, and I think that's what I'll do, because there were a couple of chapters that I was like, I don't think I can fit all that into an hour. You know, even if we don't spend a long time checking in. So I will just take you know, these next few slides and begin next week, and then pick up a couple other chapters that I was not able to get to. And we will do A Tale of Two Countries Part 2 next week.